Snow was coming down in heavy waves when I turned onto my parents' street and saw right away that something felt wrong. Every house around theirs was glowing with soft Christmas lights, little trees blinking through windows, music drifting faintly through cracks in the cold air. But my parents' house sat dark. No porch light, no tree, no movement behind the curtains, just a silent, black shape sinking under the snow like it had been emptied hours ago. That hit me harder than the cold. Before I tell you what happened after that moment, let me ask you something. What are you doing right now while listening to my story? Maybe you are driving home, maybe folding laundry, maybe letting something simmer on the stove. For me, when everything in my family shifted in a way I could never undo, I was sitting in my car on a quiet street in Wilmington, Delaware, staring at the one house in the neighborhood that looked like nobody lived in it at all. I'm Jessica Whitmore. I am 35, and I work in cybersecurity in New York City, which means I spend most days tracing problems other people cannot see. But all the training in the world did not prepare me for the feeling I had, sitting there with my breath fogging the windshield and my heart pounding in. That slow, heavy way that only disappointment can cause. I wonder what you are doing while listening to my story. Please comment below to let me know. For me, I was just turning off the radio to hear the engine hum and watched my headlights cut across the snow piling up on the front steps. Step that had no footprints, no shoveling, no sign that anyone expected me at all. I grabbed my gloves, stepped out of the car, and the cold wrapped around me instantly. My boots crunched as I crossed the street, the air sharp against my cheeks. Up close, the house looked even emptier. I rang the bell and waited. Nothing. I rang again. Still nothing. And that is where everything that followed truly began. The heater was blasting, but the air still felt cold against my face. I could see my own reflection in the side window, pale in the dashlight, hair pulled back in a rushed ponytail, eyes wide in that stunned way that comes when you know something is off, but cannot yet put words around it. On the passenger seat, the pecan pie I had brought for my dad let out one last faint wave of warmth and sugar. Like a joke, the night was playing on me. On the back seat, the stack of gifts shifted as the car idled. Blue paper for my mom, dark green for my dad, gold for my sister Lena. I had imagined the moment I would walk in carrying all of it, a little awkward but hopeful. I had not pictured this. I waited for a few seconds, telling myself they were probably in the kitchen, or in the back of the house where they could not see my headlights. Maybe they had all gone to the basement to pull out extra chairs for dinner. Maybe the power had flickered off for a minute. My mind reached for any explanation that did not involve the word forgotten. I turned off the radio so there would be no other sound in the car besides the low rumble of the engine and the soft thud of snowflakes hitting the hood. Then I picked up my phone from the cup holder and looked at the screen. No new messages. No missed calls. The last thing in the thread from my mom was from hours earlier. That morning, a short message that said she was glad I was coming and to watch the roads. I stared at it for a second, as if more words might appear if I looked hard enough. I tapped her name and hit her. The line rang in my ear once, twice, 3, 4 times. Then it slid over to voicemail with her recorded voice, bright and rushed, telling me to leave a message. I hung up before the beep. I tried my dad next. The same thing. Straight to that hollow space that did not hold him at all. Then I tried Lena. Her phone rang and rang until it disconnected itself. I stared at the contacts list on my screen. Their names lined up like doors that would not open. "All right," I said out loud in the car, though my voice sounded strange and small in the enclosed space, like it belonged to someone else. Maybe they went out for something. Maybe they are on their way back. I shut off the engine and the immediate silence pressed in. Without the rumble, I could hear the delicate patter of the snow more clearly and the faint sound of laughter from a house a few doors down. I opened the driver's side door and a wave of cold air slapped against me. The kind that finds any gap in your clothing and slides right in. I stepped out carefully, my boots crunching on the packed snow. The streetlight above cast everything in a pale orange glow. Snow clung to the branches of the skinny tree in my parents' front yard. The same tree I used to sit under in the summer with a book, trying to ignore the sound of my dad on the phone discussing contracts and deadlines. Now that tree looked like it belonged to some frozen postcard. I pulled my coat tighter around me and crossed the street, my breath coming out in little clouds. Up close, The darkness of the house felt even more absolute. No light leaking around the edges of the blinds, no glow from the television in the living room. The front steps were covered in an even layer of snow with no footprints. The wreath on the door was the same one my mom had used for years, a little faded now, a red bow drooping slightly under the weight of the weather. I hesitated at the bottom step. There was a part of me that wanted to retreat to the car, to turn the engine back on and tell myself that this was some silly misunderstanding that would make sense later. But I had come this far. I adjusted the scarf at my neck, climbed the steps, and pressed the doorbell. Nothing. No movement inside. No creak, no falling pot, no familiar sound of my mom calling out that she was coming. I waited, listening hard, the cold beginning to seep through the soles of my boots. I rang again. Still nothing. I knew where they kept the spare key, or at least where they used to keep it. In the early days of me living in New York, Mom had insisted I have a way to let myself in if I got in late, and they were asleep. I found myself glancing toward the small ceramic frog by the bushes, its chipped smile poking out from under a cap of snow. For a heartbeat, the thought crossed my mind that I could dig it out, check if the key was still there, let myself into my own childhood home like a burglar. The idea made my stomach twist. I let it go. I took a step back from the door and looked up at the blank front window. If this were any other house, I might have thought they were out at a party or still at church, but this was Christmas Eve. My mom loved to have everything ready hours in advance. There should have been smells coming from the kitchen, lights in the dining room, the soft chaos of last-minute preparations. Instead, there was this thick, unbroken silence. A memory flashed through my mind. 10-year-old me on these same steps, sitting on the top one in flannel pajamas, waiting for Dad to come home from a job, snow falling around me, my toes going cold, Mom coming to the door and telling me, "Honey, you will freeze out there. He will be here when he can." I remember stubbornly shaking my head, as if my determination could make his car appear at the end of the street. That girl was still somewhere inside me, it seemed. Still waiting. Still hoping. I wrapped my arms around myself and stood there for another few seconds, listening to the faint sound of someone's television down the block, the low hum of a distant car. No one came. No light flicked on. If anyone had glanced out of their own window right then, they would have seen a grown woman standing alone outside a dark house in the morn, falling snow, clutching her coat like armor. Eventually, I turned and walked back down the steps, more slowly this time. As I reached the sidewalk, I heard the sound of a door opening behind me, not from my parents' house, but from the one next door. Mrs. Dawson, who had lived there since I was a kid, stepped out onto her porch in a thick cardigan, a mug in her hand. Her white hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and her breath puffed in the air. "Jessica, is that you?" she called softly. I did not hear a question in it so much as a recognition. I turned toward her and tried to make my face arrange itself into something that looked like a smile. "Hey, Mrs. Dawson. Yeah, it is me. Just got in." She squinted past me at my parents' house, then back at me. "They are not home yet," she said, her voice carrying over the quiet street. "They left earlier. Must have been, I do not know, late afternoon. All dressed up. I figured they were going out to eat this year." The words landed in my chest, one by one. Not home yet. Left earlier. All dressed up. Out to eat. Alone in the middle of them was the sharp absence of my name. There was no, "And they said you were coming." No. "And they looked excited to see you." I swallowed and nodded, hoping she could not see the way my throat moved. "Yeah, maybe. I guess I got here late," I managed. She gave me a sympathetic look, the kind older women reserve for tired kids and lost pets. "Roads must be terrible in this weather," she said. "You be careful driving, honey." "I will," I told her. "Thank you. Merry Christmas." She lifted her mug in a little toast before going back inside, closing her warm yellow door behind her. I stood there for a moment, staring at that door, at the wreath on it, at the light spilling out from under the threshold, then turned back to my parents' house. Still dark and still and silent. By the time I got back into my car, my legs felt numb and my fingertips hurt in that stingy way that only comes from cold and hurt, layered together. I shut the door, started the engine, and listened as the heater coughed back to life. The windshield had already frosted on the inside, and I wiped a circle clear, with my gloved hand looking out at the shape of the house where no one had thought to leave alone, light on for me. And that was the moment something inside me shifted. Quietly, firmly, the kind of shift that does not announce itself, but changes everything that comes after. I did not know what happened in my parents' house that Christmas Eve morning, until much later. But once I learned it, the pieces slid together like they had been waiting for the right angle to lock in. The truth made the empty, dark house I had stood in front of feel even colder in my memory. It turned out the day had started warm for them, warm and careless. That morning, my dad woke up earlier than usual. Retirement had not settled into his bones yet, and he still moved like a man who expected the phone to ring with a problem only he could fix. For 30 years, he had run Ellsworth Construction, chasing deadlines and climbing scaffolding in every kind of weather. A few weeks earlier, he had sold the company and watched a lifetime of work become a stack of documents and a bank balance that did not feel real yet. He stood at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee, staring at the backyard like he was trying to understand what a man was supposed to do with himself once the work that defined him was gone. My mom moved quietly behind him, checking her list, smoothing the holiday tablecloth she had washed the night before. Christmas Eve had always been her favorite day, the kind she tried to keep predictable and safe. Then Lena walked in, carrying the cold air with her, and everything shifted. I can picture her even though I was not there. She never enters a room. She arrives, her voice bright and crisp, her hair perfectly arranged even in winter, her excitement wrapped tight around whoever is watching. And of course, she had Evan with her. I had only seen him in photos, but even in pictures, he had an energy that filled space. Confident posture, practiced smile, the kind of man who knew how to charm a room he had not yet stepped into. They brushed off the snow, laughing, and moved straight into the kitchen like they owned the morning. Mom fussed over them, asking about traffic, offering coffee. Dad folded his newspaper and gave Evan a firm nod, the silent greeting he reserved for men he had decided were worth his time. I can imagine how pleased Lena must have been, watching Dad approve of the man she had brought home. From what Mom told me later, the conversation turned quickly. Lena talked about dinner, about making this Christmas special, about how Dad deserved something grand now that he was finally retired with real money in the bank. She teased him gently about being a millionaire, saying it with pride like it reflected on her. Evan laughed and placed a hand on Dad's shoulder, asking about the sale of the company in a tone that sounded respectful but also curious. Too curious. Dad never noticed when people tried to read him. He loved talking about his work, about the men he had hired, and the buildings he had brought into existence. So when Evan started asking about finances, about whether Dad had found a reliable place to grow that new nest egg, Dad answered the way he always did. Straightforward, honest, too trusting. They sat together in the den for a while. Dad pulled up his accounts on his laptop, showing off the savings from the sale. He was proud of it. Proud enough that he forgot to wonder why a man he barely knew cared so much. Evan leaned in, nodding like he understood every number. He said the same things scammers always say, that retired money needs protection, that smart families invest early, that he knew people who helped with that. Mom told me later that she had thought it was just normal conversation. Dad had always attracted talkers, men who wanted advice or wanted to give it. She had no reason to suspect anything then. Not yet. But somewhere between those conversations and the coffee refills, Lena made her announcement. She did not want Christmas Eve dinner at home this year. She wanted to celebrate at Harrington, the expensive restaurant by the river where people with shiny lives went for special occasions. She said it was perfect to mark Dad's retirement and her new future with Evan. She wanted a night that looked as good as her relationship felt. Those were her words. Mom hesitated. I can hear her doing it. A soft pause, her hands resting on the counter. Christmas Eve had always been her day. Her house, her food, her rhythm. Changing it meant letting go of something that had anchored her for years. She told Lena she had already bought the ham. She had already planned the menu, but Lena brushed it aside, energized by the idea of candlelit tables and live music. And then she said it. Let it just be the four of us. A moment for the new family. A celebration of what is ahead. The four of them, as if the family had only four corners, as if the fifth one did not exist. Dad looked at Mom. He did not mean harm, but he was a man who liked simple solutions. He wanted to keep Lena happy, wanted to keep the peace, and wanted to believe this new fiancé would bring more stability to her life than the chaos she usually created. If Harringtons made everyone smile, then he was willing to trade the usual traditions for something easier. Mom said they should call me. Dad said he would. He pulled out his phone. That is what she told me. He pulled out his phone with every intention of letting me know they were changing plans. And then Evan asked him another question about the business sale. Or maybe Lena held up two dresses and asked which one looked better. Or maybe the laundry buzzer went off. Or maybe Dad simply saw something shine in Evan's eyes that made him feel important again for a moment. Whatever the reason, the message that was meant for me turned into a blank screen in his hand. He put the phone back in his pocket and did not pick it up again. Mom paced around the house after that, tidying up, moving things from room to room. Once or twice, she glanced at her phone on the counter. She told me she almost called, but each time she thought of it, something pulled her attention away. Lena asked for help with her makeup. Evan told Dad they should leave early to find parking. Tiny interruptions, each one too small to seem important at the time. Dad changed into a clean button-down shirt. Mom put on a dress she had been saving. Lena wore red. Evan wore confidence. They locked the house behind them and drove toward a warm restaurant filled with music and conversation, while snow began to build on their front steps. They never imagined that while they lifted their first glasses and toasted Dad's next chapter, I was turning onto their street, seeing nothing but darkness. They never imagined that while they stood under chandeliers and listened to a piano play Christmas song, I would stand in the falling snow in front of a door that did not open for me. Sometimes a story breaks long before the person holding it realizes it has cracked. That day, they were writing a story of celebration without understanding that they had erased someone from the page. Not with cruelty, not with intent, just with ease. I was the one they assumed would bend, adjust, absorb, heal. I had spent years doing exactly that. They did not notice that this time was different. As they ate their dinner, I checked into a small motel off the highway, too tired and too ashamed to call anyone. I carried my overnight bag through the cold, my breath sharp in the air, and set the pie on the small round table by the window. The lights of passing cars flickered across the curtains. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my phone. A new notification blinked at me, the same one I had ignored earlier when I was still on the road. A security alert tied to one of the financial accounts I managed for my parents. A request to change the primary recovery email. 3 days old. At the time, I had thought it was nothing. A glitch, a delayed notice. Now, in that motel room, something tightened in my chest. Not fear. Not yet. Just a sense of wrongness I had not let myself feel before. Outside, the wind pushed snow against the window in soft waves. Inside, the room smelled faintly of old carpet and heating coils. I lay back on the bed, feeling the weight of the day stretch out across my body. The cold from the empty house had followed me into this small, warm room. It settled in the space between my ribs, a quiet ache I could not shake. I told myself they had not meant to forget me. I told myself tomorrow would make more sense. I told myself I was making it bigger than it was, but underneath those soft excuses, another feeling was forming. A hum, a vibration, a warning, the kind that starts small in the back of the mind and grows roots before you even notice it. I did not know it yet, but that little blinking alert on my phone was the first tug on a thread that would unravel every secret hiding behind that bright restaurant dinner. Every lie, every betrayal. And the man who had sat smiling across from my dad that night was already weaving his way deeper into the heart of my family. I woke up in the motel with the kind of hollow feeling that comes after a night spent trying not to think too hard. The heater had hummed all night, but the air still felt thin, like the cold from the empty house had followed me into this room. For a few seconds, I stared at the ceiling and pretended I was somewhere else. Anywhere else. But then the memory of standing outside my parents' door in the snow rushed back with a force that made my stomach tighten. It was Christmas morning, and I was alone in a room that smelled faintly of cleaning fluid. The pie sat on the table by the window, the crust sunken now, no longer warm. The gifts were stacked neatly in the corner. I looked at them the way you might look at clothes from a life you no longer recognized. I threw on my coat. I could not sit there another minute wondering what had happened in that house. Hope is a strange thing. Even when it makes no sense, it still leans forward. A part of me thought maybe they had gotten home late last night. Maybe the lights would be on. Maybe someone would answer the door this time. The world outside was bright in that harsh winter way that makes everything feel too honest. The snow had stopped, but the cold remained sharp. The drive to my parents' neighborhood felt shorter in daylight. I passed kids with sleds, a man clearing his driveway with a shovel, neighbors waving to each other in heavy coats. The normalcy of it made the ache inside me feel even more out of place. When I turned onto my parents' street, my breath caught without warning. Their house was still there at the curve, looking almost the same as the night before, except now one small lamp glowed in the living room window. Not warm, not inviting, just lit, like a placeholder for a home that no one was inside to claim. I parked across the street and sat for a moment with my hands gripping the steering wheel. That little lamp did not comfort me. If anything, its dim glow made the house feel more abandoned, like someone had left in a hurry and forgotten to turn it off. Or worse, like they had not thought it mattered. My boots crunched in the snow as I crossed the street. I hesitated at the bottom of the steps, feeling again that sharp slice of humiliation that had crept in last night. But I climbed anyway. I rang the bell and listened. Nothing at first, then footsteps. Slow ones, heavy enough that I knew right away they did not belong to my mom. The door cracked open and widened. It was not my parents. It was Mrs. Dawson, my parents' longtime neighbor, wrapped in a sweater over her nightgown. She had a small cardboard box in her hands. "Well, there you are," she said softly, with a kind of relief that made my chest tighten. I stared past her into the house. The hallway lights were on, but everything beyond them looked still, untouched. No bags by the door. No shoes on the mat. The silence felt heavier in daylight. I asked her where my parents were. My voice came out steadier than I felt. She shifted the box in her hands and looked down, like she was choosing her words. "They came by my place early this morning," she said. "Dropped off a few things so nothing would freeze if the power flickered. It looked like they were heading out again when they left." She lifted the box a little toward me. "This was on their steps last night. I figured you must have come by. I did not want anything to get ruined." I took the box from her. It was one of the gifts I had brought for them. My fingers squeezed the cardboard and I felt something pinch inside me. "Thank you," I said, though the words felt small. "Did they say where they were going?" She hesitated, and her face softened in a way that told me she knew the answer would hurt. "They said something about the hotel near the river," she said. "The one with the holiday package. Dinner last night and breakfast this morning. They seemed excited. I think they went with Lena and her young man." She lifted her eyes carefully to mine. "They did not mention you, honey. I assume they thought you might come later today." The world tilted just slightly, enough to make my breath catch. "They did not mention you." 4 words that landed with more weight than I was ready to carry. I nodded slowly. I did not trust myself to speak right away. My face felt stiff, like the cold air had frozen something beneath the surface. I managed a polite smile that hurt more than anything else. "Thank you for looking out for the box," I said. "I must have dropped it last night." She watched me with the kind of knowing that made me want to disappear into the snow. "You all right, baby?" she asked quietly. I swallowed. "I'm fine," I said. "I just needed to pick this up. I will head out soon." She nodded, though she did not look convinced. "If you need anything, come by," she said, and walked carefully across the snow back to her house. I stood there alone on the porch holding the little box, staring at the house I had grown up in. Through the thin curtains, I could see the outline of the Christmas tree. It was unlit, a few presents underneath it, none of them mine. They had left it that way when they went out. Dark, bare, unbothered. I backed away slowly and walked down the steps. The cold air scraped against my skin in a way that felt too close to the sting of something I did not want to name. I got into my car and shut the door, and for a moment I let my head fall back against the seat, while the silence wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. They had chosen. That was the part I could no longer push away. They had chosen to spend Christmas Eve and Christmas morning without me. They had chosen not to text me, not to check in, not to wait. They had chosen a night with Lena and her fiancé, a man they barely knew, over a daughter who had driven through a storm to be with them. I had spent years giving them the benefit of every doubt, years telling myself they did not mean to forget, that they loved in the ways they knew how, that I was strong enough to let the small hurts slide. But this was not small. This was not forgetful. This was a choice, dressed up as an accident. My phone was in the cup holder. I looked at my dad's name. I imagined calling him and hearing something casual, something dismissive, something that would make me feel like I had overreacted. That familiar weight of blame would fall back on me. It always did. I was tired of carrying it. I picked up the phone anyway, but did not tap his name. Instead, the screen lit up with a notification I had almost forgotten. The security alert. The one from last night. The one I had avoided opening while I was still trying to pretend Christmas. Could be salvaged. Now the alert seemed to pulse at me. The small icon blinking, waiting. I tapped it open. The information loaded slowly, each line of text drawing my eyes deeper into a place I had not expected to go. The account that held the money from the sale of Ellsworth Construction. There had been a request 3 days ago. A request to change the recovery email and primary contact. The request had been approved and completed. Not by me. Not by anyone listed on the account. The new email was something I did not recognize. A name that made my pulse jump in my throat. A domain I had seen before. Not random. Not safe. Someone had slipped into their financial life without them knowing. Someone had moved quietly. Someone who knew exactly where the money was and how to reach it. I stared at the screen, and the cold inside the car felt different now. Sharper. Focused. No longer just loneliness or disappointment. Something deeper. Something is warning me. I looked back toward my parents' house one last time. The lamp still glowed faintly in the window. The curtains did not move. The silence felt heavier than it had any right to on Christmas morning. Whatever I thought I had lost last night on that dark porch, this was something else entirely. This was not about being forgotten anymore. This was about something far more dangerous creeping into the center of my family, and I had a feeling I already knew exactly who had opened the door for it. I sat in the car with that security alert open on my phone until my fingers started to ache from gripping it. The new email address stared back at me. It did not belong to my dad. It did not belong to my mom. It was a name I did not recognize, attached to a domain I had seen once in a risk report at work. Saint there outside my parents' dark house. I felt two kinds of cold at once, the sharp sting of being left out, and the deeper chill of realizing someone might be inside their financial life who did not belong there. Before I could follow that thread, another memory pushed its way forward. One I had been trying not to look at too closely. I had not told you about it yet. What happened between leaving this street last night and ending up in that motel room with the pie on the little table? I did not drive straight to the motel after I walked away from my parents' porch. At first, I just drove. The snow was still falling then, thick and relentless, swirling in the beam of my headlights. My hands were tight on the wheel, my shoulders locked from the hours on the road. I turned right without thinking at the end of the block. Then I left, then right again. I let the streets decide. I remember the ache in my chest more than the route. The way it felt like something inside me was trying to push out against my ribs. It was not just that they were not home. It was the silence. The lack of any message. The way that dark house had seemed less like an accident and more like an answer. I told myself I was being dramatic, that there was probably a simple explanation, that I would laugh about this later. But my foot stayed heavy on the gas, and I kept driving through the quiet neighborhoods until the streets opened up, and the buildings grew taller, and the lights brighter. That was how I ended up downtown. Old Wilmington dressed up for Christmas. Wreaths on lampposts. Lights strung along buildings. A few restaurants are still open despite the weather. The snow was thinner there, the sidewalks mostly cleared, the streets slick but passable. I was stopping at an intersection when I saw it. Harrington's by the river. Tall windows glowing with soft yellow light. White tablecloths are just visible through the glass. A piano near the bar where a man in a dark jacket played a slow version of a carol. warmth pouring out in every direction. I did not plan to look. My eyes just went to the windows because that is what you do when you are cold and alone, and there is light in front of you. I let the car idle. The wipers pushed away one last sheet of snow, and for a few seconds my view was perfectly clear. That is when I saw them. My sister Lena sat at a table near the window in a red dress, her hair curled softly around her shoulders. She was laughing at something, head tipped back slightly, her hand resting on the arm of the man beside her. He wore a dark suit, his profile sharp and confident, his hand covering hers in an easy way that said he was comfortable being watched. Across from them sat my parents, my mom in a dress I had not seen her wear in years. My dad is in a button-down shirt, shoulders straight, his face lit by candlelight. He looked 10 years younger at that moment. Proud, relaxed. He was lifting a glass, saying something that made Lena smile wider, and the man at her side nod with appreciation. I could not hear them through the glass, but I did not need sound. I knew my dad. I knew that look on his face. It was the look he reserved for big stories. The first big contract, the day he bought this house. The morning the sale of Ellsworth Construction cleared and the bank manager shook his hand. He was telling that man across the table about his life, about his work, about the money he had finally earned. My old chair was empty. The place where I used to sit at restaurants, the seat he used to gesture toward when the hostess asked how many, was now taken by this stranger. It was not just that they were eating without me. It was that my place had been filled like it never existed. I watched my mom lean toward the man, listening to him with the same polite focus she used to save for my dad when he talked about job sites. Her eyes were soft, her expression almost grateful. Lena squeezed his arm and said something, her eyes shining. Dad laughed, the sound visible in the way his shoulders moved. My breath fogged the inside of the windshield. For a second, I forgot to blink. The sight was almost unreal. My entire family gathered together in warm light while snow fell outside. A perfect holiday picture. The only thing missing from that image was me. My stomach lurched in a way that made me feel physically ill. My hands felt numb around the steering wheel. I could not have moved the car if I wanted to. My heartbeat slowed and sped up at the same time, like my body could not decide whether to fight or shut down. I should have driven away. I should have looked away. But I sat there for another few seconds and watched tiny details that would replay in my mind later. The way my dad turned slightly toward the man when he spoke, shoulders angled in, giving him the full weight of his attention. The way the man nodded with just the right amount of interest, not too eager, not too casual. The way Lena watched my dad while he talked, pride on her face, as if she had been the one to deliver this audience for him. I saw my dad reach into his jacket and pull out his phone for a second, checking something. For one painful moment, I let myself believe he was going to text me. Maybe he had just realized. Maybe he would look at the empty chair and remember the daughter who had driven through the storm for this. But he only glanced down briefly, nodded at whatever was on the screen, and slipped the phone back into his pocket. My phone sat cold in the cup holder. No new messages. Behind them, the piano player moved into another song. A server set down another bottle of wine. Outside, a light changed. A car behind me honked faintly, a reminder that I was blocking the lane. I jolted back into myself and eased my foot onto the gas. As I rolled forward, I let my eyes flick toward the window one last time. That was when the man at the table turned his head slightly toward the street. For a second, I saw his full face. Evan. I recognized him from the photos Lena had texted me weeks earlier. The confident tilt of his chin. The smile that seemed practiced. The eyes that missed nothing. He looked right through the glass but did not see me. I watched him raise his glass in a toast, his mouth shaping words I could not hear. My dad lifted his glass in response. Their hands and the glass stems were caught briefly in the candlelight. It looked like some kind of pact. My blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. It was not just jealousy or hurt now. It was something sharper. I remembered sitting at my desk in New York weeks earlier, skimming a report that mentioned an investment group linked to questionable transfer. The name of that group had stuck with me for a moment because it matched the email address in that alert on my phone. And now I was looking at a man whose face was connected to both. I drove away. I would like to tell you I did something dramatic, that I slammed on the brakes and ran inside. I stood at their table and demanded to know why. But I did not. I kept my foot steady and let the car carry me past the restaurant, past the warm window, past the life they had chosen to live without me that night. I watched the glow of Harrington's shrink in my rearview mirror until it was just another light among many. On the way to the motel, the anger started to push through the numbness. Not hot, wild anger. Something colder. Something precise. Every mile that passed put another thin layer between me and the part of myself that still begged to be included. By the time I checked in, carried the pie and my bag to that small room, and lay down fully dressed on the stiff bedspread, that part was very quiet. Now, sitting outside their house the next morning with the security alert open, the image of that restaurant scene burned brighter and uglier in my mind. I saw my dad leaning toward Evan again. I imagined the kind of promises a man like that could make. Safe returns. Smart strategies. Ways to grow money without lifting a finger. They had not just chosen Evan over me emotionally. I was starting to realize they might have handed him something far more dangerous. Access. The email address in the alert pulsed at me from the screen. The username was a shortened version of a familiar name. The domain belonged to a company I had once flagged in an internal review and then been told to leave alone. It was not a coincidence. I know that now. My dad had sat in that restaurant glowing with pride while a man with that email address toasted to his new future. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. The little lamp in their window grew smaller in my mirror, the way the restaurant had the night before. 2 different scenes, same center, same choice, same men sitting comfortably where I used to be. I did not know exactly how yet, but I could feel it in my bones. Whatever had happened around that fancy dinner table was now tied directly to that blinking alert on my phone. And if I followed that thread, I had a feeling I would find out just how much of my parents' future they had, quietly put in Evan's hands. I drove back to New York that afternoon with a kind of numb focus, the kind that keeps you between the lines but leaves your mind somewhere else. The highway was dirty snow and gray sky, trucks spraying slush, signs for cities and towns I barely saw. The radio stayed off. There was nothing it could play that would make a dark house and an empty place at a restaurant table hurt any less. When I reached my apartment, the quiet felt heavier than usual. I put the pie on the kitchen counter and set the unused gifts on a chair. They looked out of place, like props from a celebration that had been canceled without notice. My phone lit up when I set it down. The same security alert waited at the top of the screen, patient and cold. I told myself I would sleep first and think later. That lasted about 10 minutes. Lying in the dim light of my bedroom, I could see my parents at that table with Lena and Evan like I was still, parked outside Harrington's. Dad leaning in, talking with his hands the way he does when he wants someone to understand how important something is. Evan nodded, listening, offering little comments. My throat tightened. If I kept replaying that scene, I was going to drown in it. So I got up, made coffee that tasted bitter, pulled on real clothes, and went into the office, even though the building was half empty for them. Holiday week. The guard downstairs gave me a tired nod. The elevator hummed. My footsteps echoed in the hallway. Greetings at my desk. I felt something shift inside me. At home, I was the daughter who had been left out. Here I was the professional, whose job was to see things other people missed. I needed that version of myself more than I had ever needed her. I logged into the bank portal I used to monitor my parents' accounts and opened the detailed security log for the main savings account. That account held most of what my dad got when he sold Ellsworth Construction. Enough money to make people pay attention. Enough to ruin them if it disappeared. The access history loaded. My usual logins from New York. A couple from my parents' house when I set things up. Then a new entry from 3 days before Christmas. Different internet providers. Different location. Same account. I pulled the IP address and dropped it into one of our internal tracing tools. The map that came back was not exact, but it was close enough. Wilmington, a residential area. A cluster of buildings I knew too well. The marker hovered over the block where Lena lived. For a moment, My fingers went still on the keyboard. The image formed itself without my help. My dad at her small kitchen table. Evan with his laptop open. Lena on the couch, proud and relaxed. Dad handed over his username and password because this young man said it would be easier if he handled the details. The hurt of being left out shifted into something colder and sharper. They had not only excluded me emotionally, they had deliberately chosen to do the most vulnerable financial work in the world. One place where I was not present. I forced myself to keep going. I opened the profile changes. There it was, 3 days before Christmas. The primary email address on the account had been changed from the secured inbox I monitored to a new one. The username in that address was unfamiliar. The domain was not. I had seen it in a risk report months earlier, attached to a company flagged as a potential intermediary in questionable transfers. Hartwell Asset Group. I pulled up the list of authorized recipients on the account and saw a new name there. Hartwell. Added at the exact same time as the email change. A small test transfer had already gone through, a handful of thousands. Enough to check the pipes. Below it sat a scheduled transfer set for the following week. This one was much larger. Large enough that my chest tightened. I searched our internal database for Hartwell. There were notes from colleagues in other offices. Complex ownership structure. Connections to offshore entities. Several complaints in early stages. No formal charges yet. A recommendation in bold letters. Use caution. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a second. My dad had no idea how to read phrases like complex ownership and offshore entities. To him, money was concrete. Trucks, payroll, contracts, profit. People who prey on retirees know that. They speak in friendly terms. Stability, growth, protection. They wrap deep risk in comforting language. I thought about calling my parents right then, but every possible version of that conversation ran through my mind and ended, with them defending Evan and resenting me. So I called Lena instead. She answered on the third ring. Her voice sounded bright and thin at the same time, like she was tired but pushing through. She said the holiday had been wonderful and that Dad had needed it, that he deserved a little fun. There was no mention of me. No, how was your drive, or where did you stay? I told her I had been by the house. I kept my tone steady. She went quiet for a moment, then said that Mom had mentioned I might come, but the weather was bad, and everything came together at the last minute. She used words like last minute and crazy week, but underneath them I heard choice. I asked her directly if Evan had helped Dad with the bank account. There was a pause. Then a little edge crept into her voice. She said that Evan only helped make things easier, that he updated the contact information so Dad would not have to rely on me for every little thing. She said it like I had been holding power over them. I told her calmly that changing the primary email without telling me was not a small adjustment. I told her Hartwell Asset Group was now an authorized recipient on the account. I asked if she knew what Hartwell actually did. She let out a breath that sounded like annoyance. She said Evan worked in investments and knew what he was doing. She said I was overreacting, the way I always did when I was not in control. She said Dad trusted him, and that should be enough. Jealous, controlling, always looking for problems. Those were the shadows around her words, the old story she kept about me. I wanted to snap back. I wanted to remind her who fixed things when they fell apart, who read the fine print, who took the late-night calls. Instead, I used the voice I used in meetings when someone did not want to hear. A risk, but needed to. I said that she did not have to believe me about Evan, but the patterns were the same as the cases I worked. I said if they wanted to invest through him, that was their choice as adults, but they needed to understand that Hartwell was not some friendly neighborhood bank. I told her there was a large transfer scheduled for the following week. I asked if Dad had any idea where that money was really going. There was silence for a beat. Then she said she was tired of me acting like the only smart person in the family. Her voice wobbled, just barely when she said it, and that wobble hurt more than the words. I did not trust myself to respond the way I wanted to, so I told her the simple truth. I said that regardless of how she felt about me, I would be watching the account. I said that if I saw signs that their money was being siphoned off, I would step in, even if it made everyone angry. She told me that my drama was not welcome and that I should let Dad enjoy his retirement. Then she ended the call. I sat in the quiet office with the phone in my hand and stared at my reflection on the black screen. My own face looked older at that moment, not from age, from the weight of realizing my family had walked into danger and called it happiness. I turned back to the computer. Fine, they could resent me. They could talk about me over nice dinners and tell each other I was jealous. None of that would stop Hardwell from taking what it wanted if no one stood in the way. I pulled up an external database of consumer complaints and legal filings. Once I filtered for Hartwell and for entities with shared directors, a pattern emerged. A retired teacher in one state, a widowed man in another, all told similar stories. A smooth advisor, promises of safe growth, transfers into structures they did not fully understand. Then sudden silence, locked portals, confusing paperwork, reluctant lawyers. Every case described a family left ashamed and confused. People in their 60s and 70s doubted their own judgment, convinced they had been stupid instead of targeted. I thought of my dad. A man who could look at an empty lot and see a building before a blueprint existed. A man who knew how to read soil and sky, but not small print buried in digital forms. The pending transfer on his account sat there on my screen, waiting. A quiet line of text that represented years of sweat and sacrifice. I checked the date again. 1 week, just long enough for everyone to reassure each other that nothing was wrong. I was not just a daughter now. I was the only firewall between my parents and a loss they would never recover from, financially or emotionally. I printed the activity log and the Hartwell entries and slid them into a folder. My hands were steady in a way they had not been since that night outside the dark house. Hurt would have to wait. Right now, there was work to do. I shut down my computer, tucked the folder under my arm, and headed. The building felt even emptier than when I arrived. Outside, the city lights flickered in the late afternoon haze. Somewhere out there, my parents were probably telling themselves that this was finally their time to relax, that they had earned a break from worry. They had no idea that the biggest risk they had ever taken was already ticking quietly in the background of their new life. And as I knew with a certainty that made my skin prickle that if I did not move fast, that quiet ticking was going to turn into an explosion none of us could outrun. I took the folder home that night like it was something breakable. I set it on my kitchen table next to the cold pie and the untouched gifts, then just stood there for a moment staring at it. The apartment was quiet, the city humming faintly outside my windows. It was the kind of stillness that usually calmed me. This time, it felt like a weight. I sat down, opened the folder, and went through the pages again. The note showing Hartwell Asset Group had been added as a recipient. The little line that said a test transfer had already cleared. The larger transfer is scheduled for the following week. Every line on those pages traced the shape of a choice my parents had made. They had chosen to trust a man they barely knew instead of the daughter who spent her life unraveling schemes like his. They had chosen to sit at a warm restaurant table with him while I sat outside, in my car, and watched. They had chosen to let him into their future and shut me out. The hurt swelled up again, thick and hot, but under it there was something harder. A stubborn core that had kept me alive in rooms where people dismissed my warnings as paranoia. I knew what this pattern looked like. I had seen the aftermath too many times to pretend I did not. I tried to imagine doing nothing, letting that transfer go through, letting my parents learn the hard way that money does not care how proud you are. The idea made my stomach flip. I pressed my hands flat on the table and made myself breathe slowly, in through my nose, out through my mouth. There were two versions of me sitting in that chair, the daughter they had left out of Christmas, and the woman who knew how to follow money. Only one of them was useful right now. I decided I would give my dad one clear warning before I did anything more formal. Not as an analyst, as his child. I waited until the next morning. The light outside was dull and flat, that in-between holiday light that does not belong fully to any day. I made coffee and held the mug in my hands until the warmth soaked into my fingers, then picked up my phone and tapped his name. He answered on the second ring. For a moment, hearing his voice pulled me back to being a teenager calling from a payphone when my car had broken down. That old reflex to make everything sound fine, even when it was not, almost taken over. He asked where I was. I told him I had gone back to New York. I said I had been by the house. I waited, hoping he might fill in the missing pieces on his own. He did not. He just said the roads had been bad and that it had all been a little last minute. And that he figured I would understand. There was that word again. Understand. The family code is to be quiet, so we do not have to feel guilty. I swallowed and kept my voice steady. I told him I needed to talk about his bank account. The moment I said it, his tone changed. He sounded wary, like I had reached for a tool he did not want me holding. He said everything was fine. He said Evan had helped him get set up with better access. He said they had talked it through and that I did not need to worry. I told him about the email change. I told him about Hartwell Asset Group being added as a recipient. I told him about the test transfer and the larger one scheduled for the following week. I did not raise my voice. I did not lecture. I laid out the facts like I would in any risk meeting. He sighed, the long, heavy kind of sigh that says, "You are already the problem," before the words even land. He said I was always digging, always looking for drama. He said Evan worked in investments and actually understood these things. He reminded me that Evan had contacts, that he knew how to make money grow, that this was how people with means handled their finances. I could feel my teeth pressing together. I said quietly that people with means were exactly the kind of people firms like Hartwell like to target. I told him our internal system listed them as cautionary. I told him there were complaints tied to similar structures. I did not tell him everything I had seen. I thought giving him too much at once would only make him dig in. He let me finish. Then he said something I had heard in different forms my whole life. "Jessica, you always make everything a mess. We just want to enjoy the Christmas and New Year holidays in peace. For one, let the family be happy and stop turning everything into an investigation." The words hit harder than if he had shouted. They wrapped everything into one neat package. His discomfort, my role as the one who spoiled moods, the idea that my concern was not love but interference. I stared at the far wall of my kitchen while he talked, the little plant on the windowsill, the chipped edge of a tile, things that were solid and would not change shape on me. I asked him one last question. Did he really believe Evan would protect his interests better than I would? He said Evan respected him. He said Evan listened. The implication sat there between us. That I did not. That my warnings were not respect, but criticism. I felt something in me pull back then. Not break. Pull back, like a hand being taken slowly off a hot stove. I told him, in a voice calmer than I felt, that I had given him my best advice. That he could ignore it if he chose. But if I saw evidence that someone was about to steal his future, I would act, whether he liked it or not. He told me not to threaten him. He said he was tired. He said he wanted to enjoy what he had earned without me hovering over every single decision. He said again that he wanted peace for the holidays. We ended the call with a thin goodbye that did not sound like us, or maybe sounded exactly like who we had been for a long time, without my wanting to see it. Afterward, I sat there for a full minute, the phone still in my hand, listening to the faint buzz of the building around me. A neighbor's television. A door closing down the hall. The normal world going about its business. My dad had just told me, in his own way, that he would rather risk everything than admit he might have chosen the wrong man to trust. I went into the office again, the folder under my arm. This time I did not tell myself I was just being a daughter. I sat down at my desk, logged in, and started documenting everything in a way that would make sense to people who did not care about family dynamics. I wrote a brief internal risk memo. I did not mention my parents by name. I described a client who had recently sold a privately held construction company and deposited a large sum into a savings account. I noted that this client had been approached by an entity connected to Hartwell Asset Group, that transfers were being initiated, that internal risk flags already existed around Hartwell and its affiliates. I marked the memo for limited circulation and sent it to the small circle of colleagues who handled early warnings. I knew it would not stop anything immediately, Systems like ours turned slowly, but I also knew that when things went bad, someone would eventually ask who saw it coming. I wanted a trail that showed I had not looked away. When the memo was sent, I set up additional alerts on the account, not just for transfers, but for access attempts, profile changes, anything that might signal the situation was escalating faster than the scheduled date. By the time I left the office, the sky was already dark again. The city was wrapped in cold light and leftover decorations. I walked home with the folder pressed to my side, my scarf pulled up around my neck, my thoughts moving in two directions at once. Part of me kept replaying my dad's voice. We just want peace. The other part went over numbers and names, checking them for patterns. Every time I pictured his face at that restaurant table, lit from below by candles and above by his own pride, my jaw tightened. Back at my apartment, I scanned the documents into my personal encrypted drive. Account logs, risk notes, everything that could vanish quickly if someone decided to restrict my access. I was not supposed to keep personal copies of client-related material. I knew that. I did it anyway. Some rules bend when a life's work is at stake. That was when my phone buzzed. I expected another useless sale email or a weather alert. Instead, there was a single new text from an unknown number. No contact name, no context. It said only this: stop looking. Some things are above your pay grade. I read the sentence twice, 3 times, my thumb hovering over the screen. The words were simple. The tone was not. It was not my dad. It was not Lena. This was the voice of someone who believed they could scare people off with a vague threat. Someone who assumed the promise of trouble would make me back away from whatever line I was nearing. My first instinct was a quick spike of fear. It was one thing to chase patterns in systems where I was protected by protocols and teams. It was another to realize that this time, whatever I had touched was close enough to my own life that someone bothered to reach out and warn me. I took a slow breath and looked around my small kitchen. The plants, the magnets on the fridge, the pile of mail. This was my ground, my life, my choices. I did something very simple. I took a screenshot of the text and saved it into the same secure folder as the other documents. I did not respond. I did not block the number. I wanted to see if they would try again. Then I went to the window and looked out at the city. The lights downtown blinked through the winter air. Somewhere a siren wailed briefly and then faded. Somewhere my parents were probably telling themselves they had done the right thing by trusting Evan. Somewhere he might be smiling at his phone, confident that one little warning was all it would take to keep me quiet. He did not know me at all. I pressed my forehead lightly against the cool glass and watched my own reflection stare back. Whatever line I had crossed was real. Whatever sat on the other side of this money trail was big enough that people were willing to lean on me from the shadows. That should have made me step back. Instead, it told me I was finally looking in exactly the right place. The text from the unknown number stayed in my mind all night like a splinter. Stop looking. Some things are above your pay grade. That was not the voice of a worried dad or a panicked sister. That was someone who felt entitled to my silence. The more I thought about it, the less afraid and the more focused I felt. The next morning, the city was washed in that hard winter light that makes everything look a little too sharp. I went into the office again, even though I could have worked from home. Something about the building, the systems, the security doors made me feel like I had firmer ground under my feet. I logged in, watched the internal dashboard load, and reminded myself that facts were still facts, no matter how messy the past emotions around them were. My first call was to Lisa, a colleague in another part of the risk unit who owed me a favor. I did not mention my parents. I told her I needed an off-the-record look at a vendor called Hartwell Asset Group and any connected entities. I said I had noticed overlapping patterns and needed her eyes on the corporate tree. There was a pause on the line. She asked if this was about that construction sale client I had referenced in my memo. I told her it was, and that there was more family exposure than our files reflected. Her voice softened. She said she would pull what she could and call me back. While I waited, I went back over the bank activity again, this time paying closer attention to the dates and the language in the transaction notes. That first test transfer to Hartwell had a bland description. Advisory retainer. The pending transfer for the following week had something worse. Reallocation to structured products. Phrases designed to sound sophisticated and harmless at the same time. There were no documents attached in the portal. Whatever papers my dad had signed, he had done it offline, probably with Evan talking him through each page. I pictured Dad at Lena's small dining table, reading glasses slipping down his nose, pen in his hand. Mina pouring coffee, Evan pointing at signature lines. My dad had always been proud of his ability to make decisions without asking for help. That pride had built things that lasted. Now it was being used against him. Lisa called back an hour later. Her voice was lower than usual, like she did not want anyone on her end overhearing more than they had to. She said that Hartwell was on a watch list in 3 regions. Nothing public yet, but enough internal chatter to make her nervous. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She had found cross-references between Hartwell's linked accounts and a newly created consulting entity in Delaware with a name that included the word Ellsworth. I asked her to repeat it. She said Ellsworth Advisory Services. I registered 3 months earlier. A shell with no staff, no website, no real presence. The paperwork listed a familiar address in Wilmington and showed my dad's full name as an officer. Peter Ellsworth Whitmore. My head started to pound. I asked who set it up. There was a pause. Lisa said the filing agent of record was a firm that frequently worked with Hartwell and its partners. It hit me then that this was bigger than my parents being clients. On paper, my dad was part of the structure itself. Lisa hesitated, then said she was going to pretend she had never seen my memo and that this conversation had never happened. She said there were already politics around this cluster of entities and that I needed to be careful. Before she hung up, she added that personal involvement had a way of turning professionals into collateral when things went bad. Her way of telling me to watch my back without saying the words. I sat there for a long moment staring at the corporate registry printout she had forwarded. The name Ellsworth Advisory Services sat on the screen like a stain. Dad had retired from Ellsworth Construction, trusting that he was closing a chapter cleanly. Instead, with some strokes of a pen, Evan had made him part of a shadow network he did not understand. If regulators started pulling on that knot, my dad's name would be tangled in it from the beginning. I knew I could not explain any of this to him over the phone. He barely tolerated my warnings about a simple email change. Trying to walk him through shell entities and advisory structures while he sat in his favorite chair pretending not to be tired would sound to him like I was, accusing him of something. I needed more than theories. I needed to see Evan's world up close. Over the next day, I dug quietly through public records and industry articles. I used only open sources, staying away from anything that would light up internal audit trails. I confirmed what I already suspected. Evan did not list Hartwell as his employer on social media. Instead, he framed himself as an independent consultant aligned with a larger investment group. There were photos of him at conferences, shaking hands with men who liked expensive watches and thin smiles. There were no obvious red flags to the casual eye. That was the point. One registration form put a physical address to Hartwell-affiliated operations on the East Coast, an office complex in Jersey City, glass, metal, an impressive lobby, a place that looked respectable enough to make nervous retirees feel better when they came in for a meeting. Another listing showed a smaller administrative site in Wilmington itself, a floor in a bland building not far from the river. I printed the addresses and circled the one in Wilmington. It was too close to my parents' life to ignore. I drove down the next morning. The highway this time was clearer, the storm fully behind us. The miles gave me too much space to think. I kept seeing my dad's signature on those filings, the way his name, written in neat, slightly shaky letters, could be used to claim he had approved structures far beyond anything he actually understood. I reached Wilmington by late morning and parked a few blocks from the address I had found. The Hartwell Associated office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building with a sandwich shop at street level and a dentist on the 2nd floor. There was a discreet directory in the lobby with a list of tenants. Hartwell Services LLC was printed on a small plastic strip. No logo, no flair. I bought a coffee from the shop and chose a table near the window where I could see the entrance. My heart thudded a little harder than usual. Stakeouts are cleaner in theory than in real life. In real life, your hands shake on the cup, and you worry that everyone can tell. You are not there for the tuna melt. For a while, nothing happened. People went in and out, most of them heading to the dentist. A delivery driver dropped off a box and left. My coffee cooled. I checked my phone. No new alerts on my parents' account yet. The pending transfer still sat there in the system like a held breath. Then I saw him. Evan walked up the sidewalk wearing a dark coat and carrying a leather briefcase. Even from a distance, he moved with that easy confidence that had charmed my sister and my parents. He paused at the building directory for a second, like he was making sure he still liked the look of his own name, then went inside. I felt a strange mix of rage and detachment. This was the man who had sat in my dad's chair at the restaurant table, who had smiled across candlelight while wiring himself into the center of my family's future. He did not look like a villain. He looked like a man who believed the world owed him opportunity. I watched the doorway, waiting. 15 minutes passed. 20. I was finishing the last of my now lukewarm coffee when another man approached. The building. This one was older, shorter, wearing a heavy coat and a knit hat pulled low. He carried a plain envelope in his hand. He stepped inside. Less than a minute later, he came back out, and this time Evan was with him. They stopped just outside the door. The older man handed Evan the envelope and said something I could not hear. Evan glanced around the street in a quick sweep, then grinned and patted the man's shoulder before tucking the envelope into the possible, his briefcase. They stood there talking for another moment. Two men in front of an ordinary building on an ordinary winter day. If you did not know what you were looking at, you might have thought it was nothing. A casual business exchange, a favor, a normal part of their world. I raised my phone slowly under the table and snapped a picture through the glass. It was not perfect. There was a bit of reflection in the corner from the lights behind me, but it was clear enough to see faces, posture, the envelope changing hands, the building signs in the background. A few seconds later, Evan and the older man went their separate ways. Evan checked his phone as he walked, looking relaxed. The other man disappeared around the corner. My pulse pounded in my ears. I saved the photo and sent a copy to my secure drive. Then I sat there and let myself feel scared for the first time. Not because I thought they had seen me. I was careful. But because it confirmed what I had been afraid of. Whatever Evan was doing in my parents' life was not some harmless side project. He was part of an active network that moved things around quietly, off paper, in ways that made it hard for honest people to understand where their money had gone. The weight of my parents' choices settled over me again. They had not simply trusted the wrong person with advice. They had allowed that person to walk them into a web where his comfort and their ignorance met perfectly. I threw my empty cup away and stepped out into the cold. The air hit my face like a slap. I pulled my coat tighter and started back toward my car, the building behind me pressing against my shoulder blades like a gaze. My phone buzzed as I reached the corner. For a heartbeat, I thought it was another anonymous warning. Instead, it was an alert from the bank system. The pending transfer out of my parents' account had just been modified. The date had moved up. The alert hit my phone while I was still walking toward my car, the cold biting through my coat. I opened the banking app and stared as the screen loaded. The pending transfer from my parents' savings had been modified. The date had been moved up. Whoever had taken control of their account was not waiting anymore. A tremor went through me. Not fear exactly, but something sharper. I called the fraud liaison at the bank using my firm's internal contact list. His name was Carter. He pulled up the account, saw the email change, saw Hartwell listed as a recipient, and I heard the shift in his voice. He told me he could put a temporary risk flag on the transfer, but only my dad could fully freeze it. Policy. Procedure. Limits that might cost everything. When I hung up, I knew I had no choice left. I had to go back to the house. Their lights were on when I pulled into the driveway. The front door opened after I rang the bell. My mom looked at me as if she had been expecting something bad but did not want to admit it. She stepped aside. My dad sat at the dining table with papers spread in front of him, glasses low on his nose. I put the folder down in front of him and told him everything quickly, cleanly, without drama. Hartwell. The email changed. The transfer date moved. Shell entities. Risk lists. I showed him the printout so he would see it was not my imagination. He listened, face unreadable. When I finished, he said Evan had explained all of this, that the structure was normal. That was how investments worked now. He said my job made me paranoid, that he did not need his oldest daughter talking to him like he was a helpless man. The words hit harder than a shout. I told him I was not calling him helpless. I was calling him targeted. I explained how fraud works, how charm is often the first step, how fast money is a trap. He pushed his chair back and insisted he knew what he was doing. He said that after selling his company, after working all his life, he deserved to trust someone who finally treated him like a partner. He did not say my name. He did not look at me when he spoke. My mom tried to step between us, saying it was the holidays, saying this could win, saying everything sounded scarier when delivered in my tone. She asked me quietly if maybe I had misunderstood something. The towel in her hands trembled. Before I could respond, the front door opened and Lena walked in, her cheeks pink from the cold. She stopped when she saw the papers, then rolled her eyes in a way that told me she had already taken sides. She said Evan warned her this might happen, that I would make trouble because I had never trusted him. She said I was jealous that he and Dad had a bond. I had to swallow hard before I answered. I told her jealousy had nothing to do with it. The transfers, the structures, the email rerouting, those were facts, not feelings. I pointed at the scheduled transfer. I explained it in simple language. Once the money left, it would jump through layered entities, possibly offshore. Recovery would be nearly impossible. My dad might even be blamed for participating. For a flicker of a moment, I saw fear in his face, a small crack in the confidence Evan had built in him. It was gone almost as fast as it appeared. I told him he could freeze the transfer with a phone call. He could take time afterward to decide what to do. No pressure. Just safety. Just space to think. He stared at the papers. My mom watched him, holding her breath. Then he straightened. He said he was tired of being treated like an old man who could not make decisions. He said I twisted everything into danger. He said I needed to respect his choices. He said it was his life, his money, and his future. Lena smiled, small and tight, as if the verdict had gone her way. I gathered the papers slowly. My hands were steady even as my chest ached. I told him I loved him. I told him I had done everything I could. I told him if he changed his mind before the transfer date, he could call me. The last words cracked just slightly. He did not walk me to the door. My mom followed me to the hallway. She touched my arm lightly and whispered that she knew I meant well, that I always did, but that he could not bear admitting he might be wrong. Not after building a life with his hands, not after wanting a peaceful retirement. She said Evan made him feel young again, useful again, proud again. I told her quietly that pride was the most dangerous bait of all. Outside, the cold wrapped around me. I sat in my car, staring at the house. The living room light glowed in the window. Behind it, my dad clung to the illusion that he had finally found someone who saw him as more than a man past his prime. He did not see the danger sitting at his table, smiling. I drove until the houses thinned out and the highway opened in front of me. I pulled into a gas station, parked under a buzzing light, and let my forehead rest against the steering wheel. There was no softness left in what I needed to do next. If I could not reach him as his daughter, I would have to reach him as evidence. My phone vibrated. A new internal system alert appeared. Hartwell Asset Group had just been added to a preliminary federal inquiry list. For a long moment, the cold in my chest turned into something darker. This was no longer only about my family. This was about the kind of storm that does not stop at one house. And I knew, with a clarity that felt like the drop on a roller coaster, that Evan was not going to let his plans fall apart quietly. The notification about the federal inquiry list stayed on my phone as I stood, beside the gas pump, the cold air slicing through my coat. Hartwell Asset Group was now under federal review. Chief flickered through me, followed almost immediately by fear of what that meant for my dad. His shell company carried his full name. Investigators would not know he had been manipulated. They would only see signatures. I drove back to New York in a silence that felt heavy, as if the whole car carried the weight with me. Once inside my apartment, I dropped my keys and opened my laptop. An internal advisory waited in my inbox. Hartwell and related entities were now classified as high-priority review. The memo was formal, but beneath the careful wording I could feel urgency pressing through. A network of scams, victims in multiple states, patterns growing clearer. The next morning, I received the email that changed everything. A federal financial crimes investigator requested an interview with me. They referenced my internal memo and other leads that pointed to my knowledge of Hartwell's structure. My hands went cold as I read it. I said yes. There was no other choice. That afternoon, my mom called. Her voice trembled as she said my dad had received a letter requesting clarification about recent advisory relationships and unusual transfers. She said he had gone very quiet, then angry. She said he was blaming me. Blaming, not questioning. The same old story. I told her gently that oversight did not appear out of thin air. Multiple red flags had likely been raised. She asked if I had said anything to anyone. I told her I had done what my job required. She whispered she did not know how to be neutral anymore, stuck between his pride and my warnings. I told her neutrality was not a safe place to stand in this. The next day, I sat in a beige room with a federal investigator who introduced herself with tired eyes and a steady voice. She asked me to start at the beginning and walk her through everything. I kept my tone calm, sticking to facts. The email changed. The login from my sister's apartment building, the shell company, the pending transfer. The photograph of Evan outside the Wilmington office. She listened without interrupting. Then she pushed a packet of documents toward me. Redacted pages. Shell records. Names I had not seen before. Hartwell sat in the center like a poisonous core. She told me they had suspected a network but lacked the final connections. My dad's shell company filled in part of the pattern. She asked whether he understood what he had signed. I said I doubted he grasped the structure. She nodded like she had seen that pattern 100 times. She mentioned wire communications, suggesting someone planned to shift liability onto a regional partner if things went bad. That partner was the shell with my dad's name. They needed testimony showing he was not acting knowingly. She was telling me gently that silence would not protect him now. I left the building into bright, cold sunlight, feeling unsteady. My phone buzzed before I reached the subway entrance. A text from Lena. She wrote that men had come to the house asking questions about Dad's financial relationships. She said Evan told her it was nothing. Those jealous competitors started rumors. She asked me what I had done. I told her I had answered questions truthfully. She wrote back that I was destroying their lives. She said Evan believed everything would blow over if I stopped feeding it. Her desperation came through the screen. Her fear was real. But so was the danger. That evening, my dad called. His voice was low and taut. He said men in suits had come to his study. They asked about Hartwell and Ellsworth Advisory Services. Neighbors saw. He said he had built his life cleanly and did not deserve humiliation. Every word struck a place inside me that still remembered him lifting me into the truck bed to watch concrete being poured. He asked if I understood what I had caused. I told him quietly that this would have happened whether I spoke or not. Complaints had been filed in other regions. Investigators had been circling for months. I said the only difference now was that I was trying to keep him from being named as a partner in a scheme he did not understand. He went silent. Then he said the only thing he wanted was peace in retirement. No trouble, no spotlight, no scandal. He hung up before I could say more. The next morning, the investigator called again. She said subpoenas had gone out. Those things would move quickly now. She warned me there might be press inquiries, that my role might become public. She said I should get my own lawyer. Not a threat, a protection. I hired one that afternoon, a calm man with steady eyes who listened carefully as I laid everything out. He told me that my only job was to tell the truth the same way every time. The law would sort the rest. It was strangely comforting. 2 days later, the first headline appeared. It was small, buried on a regional news site. Federal inquiry into investment networks tied to advisory practices. No names yet, no photos, but Hartwell was named. I read it twice. My dad's name was not there. Mine was not either. but the direction was clear. That evening, Lena called again. Her voice shook. She said Evan had been distant all day. On calls, he would not explain. She said he told her not to worry, that he had handled things like this before. Then she asked me, very quietly, whether our dad could be blamed, whether he could actually go to jail. I told her I did not know how far this would go, but the network Evan worked in had a habit of using older clients as shields. If things collapsed, Dad could look like a willing partner. Her breath stuttered. She said she had only wanted him to feel proud again. She began crying. I let her, because there was no comfort I could give that would not be a lie. Late at night, as I was turning off my lamp, my phone buzzed with one more message from the investigator. Short, direct. They had enough to move from inquiry to full action. Arrests would begin soon. She thought I should know. I lay in the dark listening to the hum of traffic far below. My dad sat in his study somewhere, stewing in fear and anger. My mom paced the rooms trying to keep the house from cracking in half. Lena clung to a man who was running out of exits. And Evan, somewhere out on that winter night, was preparing to learn that the walls around him were closing faster than he ever imagined. The arrest began on a gray January morning. I was pouring coffee when the investigator's message came through telling me they had taken several Hartwell affiliates into custody. One of the names was Evan. I set the mug down and felt something inside me unclench. Outside, New York moved like any other winter day, but somewhere in Wilmington, a man who had smiled across my family's table was being walked through a lobby in handcuffs. By noon, the news sites had the footage. A camera caught Evan as agents guided him out of a hotel near the river. His coat looked neat, his hair combed, but his face had lost the easy charm he carried like a second skin. Seeing him like that made something tighten in my chest, not out of pity, but out of the quiet confirmation that everything I had feared was real. Lena called minutes later. Her voice was shaking. She had seen the footage and said the neighbors were already sending it around. She said Dad had turned off the television, but she knew he had watched it once. She kept repeating that she had believed Evan, that she had only wanted our family to look like one of those polished holidays. Newsletters other people sent out. I told her I knew she had not meant harm. I did not tell her that choosing not to listen had been its own wound. She already knew. The investigator called next. Her tone was steady, almost brisk. She said Evan was already trying to position himself as a minor player. She said he was naming names, pointing to structures, and that my dad's shell company kept coming up as a convenient place for blame. She told me they needed my dad to sit for a formal recorded interview as a witness. She asked if I would be willing to be present. I said yes. The next morning, I drove to Delaware again. The federal building felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. My parents were waiting in the lobby. My mom looked like she had not slept. My dad looked smaller in his coat, as if pride had finally loosened its grip on him. We sat in a small conference room with a camera and a microphone on the table. The investigator began the interview. She was respectful, but she did not soften the questions. She laid out the timeline of the shell company's formation, the signatures, the transfers. She asked if my dad understood that Ellsworth Advisory Services had no staff, no operations, no actual purpose besides routing funds. My dad stared at the papers as if they were written in another language. He admitted he had signed where Evan pointed. He admitted he had believed the words efficient, modern, streamlined. He said he had trusted the person in front of him because that person had spoken with confidence and treated him with respect. The honesty in his voice hurt more than any anger could. When she asked if he had intended to hide money or deceive officials, he answered firmly. No, he had wanted to protect his retirement. That was the truth, simple and bare. At one point he glanced at me, searching for steadiness. I gave him a small nod. We were not dad and daughter at that moment. We were two people trying to steer around the edge of something that could swallow him whole. When the interview ended, the investigator thanked him. She did not promise safety, but she told him the truth always mattered. We walked out into the cold parking lot. My dad stopped near my car and looked at me with an expression I had not seen since childhood. He said he had watched the footage of Evan being led away and had realized how much he had wanted to feel valued again. He said he had poured trust into the wrong man. He said the hardest part was knowing he had believed that man more than he had. Believed me. He did not say sorry, but it was there, in the space between his words. I told him I understood. I told him that needing to feel respected was not a weakness. I told him that good people often fall hardest because they assume others have the same heart. He nodded once, then placed his hand on my shoulder for a brief second before walking to the car. The weeks after were slow in the way legal matters always are. Evan took a plea deal. He admitted to orchestrating deceptive advisory structures and provided information on others. My dad was not charged. The documents and testimony showed he had been used, not partnered. His finances took a hit, but the large transfer had been blocked in time. The shell company was dissolved. His name was removed from every structure it had touched. The relief in my mom's voice when she told me was quiet and fragile, like a bird landing on a windowsill. The cost, though, stayed. My dad's pride cracked. His reputation in town shifted. People whispered. Some avoided them. Lena left Evan months later. She said she could not look at him and remember who she had defended. She moved back home for a time, helping my mom sort through bills and old documents. I did not rush into their lives. I gave them space. We spoke more than before, but less than what some families might call close. We were rebuilding on the parts that had not collapsed. One afternoon in early spring, a package arrived at my apartment. Inside was a framed photo from our old cabin. I was 10 years old, laughing with a fishing pole in my hands. My dad stood behind me with his hand on my shoulder. There was a note tucked behind the frame. He wrote that he had finally seen everything clearly, that he understood what could have happened. He wrote that he had transferred the cabin to my name, not as payment, not as an apology, but as acknowledgement that I had protected something he had been unable to, protect himself. I drove to the cabin alone that summer. The place looked older, but peaceful. I fixed small things, a loose step, a broken hinge. The work felt grounding, as if the land itself understood what we had all survived. My parents visited once. We sat on the porch eating sandwiches, watching the lake ripple under the wind. Conversations stayed light. My mom talked about her garden. My dad mentioned he had met with a vetted financial counselor. He said he was learning to ask questions again. He said it quietly, almost embarrassed, but I could hear the strength returning underneath. When they left that afternoon, my mom hugged me tightly. My dad paused, looked at the water, then said he hoped we could try again. Not return to what was, but build something smaller and more honest. I told him yes. Back in New York, life moved on. I kept doing my work. I flagged patterns. I spoke up when something felt wrong. Every time I recognized a tactic Evan had used, I pressed a little harder, and the quiet revenge settled in. Not the kind with flames or shouts, the kind where truth outlasts the lies, where consequences land exactly where they belong. Evan served his time. My dad reclaimed control of his life. My mom regained her calm. Lena built something gentler for herself. As for me, I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand your ground, even while your own heart is cracking. If you have listened all the way to the end of my story, I want to leave you with something. If you have ever been told you are too much or not enough for your own family, remember this. Silence can be power when it is chosen, not forced, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Not because it destroys people, but because it restores the parts of you that were taken for granted. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from. I would love to hear your story too.